Some people believe that most of the rock subgenres that sprang up in the 70s, 80s and 90s were just further developments on musical ideas that had already been invented in the 60s. Most punk rock bands from the late 70s were influenced by bands and artists from the 50s and 60s. But there are plenty of recordings from the 60s, which already sounded like punk recordings from the 70s and were at least 10 years ahead of their time. In this video, we're going to take a look at 10 proto-punk tracks released in Britain in 1966 and 1967. Let's begin. This single by a group called The Voice is one of the wildest British singles of 1966. Some sources erroneously claim that future David Bowie guitarist Mick Ronson provided the aggressive fuzz guitar featured on this song. But Ronson joined the band shortly after the release of this 45 and didn't play on the track. The story of The Voice is quite unusual. Several members of the group were members of a religious cult called The Process. The Process worshipped both Christ and Satan, and the song's apocalyptic lyrics were apparently influenced by the message that the religious cult used to preach. Mick Ronson and drummer Dave Bradfield, who both hailed from Hull, joined the group shortly after the single was recorded. But they soon found themselves out of work when the religious group decided to move to the Bahamas in June 1966. Later in 1969, the Process Church established a base of operations in the United States, but their reputation was severely damaged when prosecutors investigating the murders committed by the Manson family suggested that there were links between Charles Manson and the religious cult. The connections, however, were never officially proven. Wimple Winch only managed to release 3 singles during their brief existence, but those 3 45s are among the most aggressive British singles of 1966 and 1967. Save My Soul was released in June 1966, and it's yet another song which meant nothing in the charts when it was originally released, but is now regarded as a proto-punk classic from that era. This was the group's second 45, and it's safe to say that most of the record-buying public from 1966 was probably not ready for this type of sonic assault. Wimple Winch were the house band at a club in Stockport called The Sinking Ship, which was run by their manager Mike Carr. The single was immensely popular locally when it was originally released. But despite being listed as a climber by Radio London, the song was not successful nationally. A press release from that period stated,
"The powerful raw-sounding Save My Soul, released on June 17, has caused a tremendous reaction wherever they have performed it."
Here they come, see them run, see them fight each other, see the sticks, see the stones, see them run the cover.
Wimple Winch released their third single in January 1967, and this is yet another excellent slice of proto-punk which has reached cult status due to its appearance on multiple compilations over the years. After the single was released, the sinking ship caught fire and destroyed the group's equipment, and as a result, Fontana Records decided not to re-sign the group. Therefore, Rumble on Mersey Square South became the band's third and final single, and went down in history as the last breath from a band that pioneered punk rock in the 60s. This single by a band called Alan Pound's Get Rich is one of those 1966 singles which sounded way ahead of its time. In fact, it wouldn't be strange to mistake this single for a punk or even post-punk single from the late 70s or early 80s. The song had a truly strange way out sound. It sounded crude and distorted, but it also had a very melodic psychedelic feel. Unfortunately, the single was barely promoted and it only managed to get this small review from Record Mirror. The song wasn't rediscovered until several years later, when it was featured on several compilations of rare British singles from the 60s. And another track from 1966 which sounded way ahead of its time, was this song by a group called The Buzz. This Way Out track by a band called The Buzz was produced by genius British producer Joe Meek. Meek hadn't had a hit since early 1964, when the Honeycombs topped the charts with the song Have I the Right. But the lack of success didn't stop him from continuing to experiment with his DIY production techniques and coming up with weird and unusual sounds. The Buzz originally hailed from Edinburgh, and just like many bands from that era, they moved to London in search of fame and fortune. This was the band's second single, and it's definitely one of the wildest and most way out freakbeat tunes from that period.
You ain't helping me, you're holding me down.
Not surprisingly, the song went over the heads of the record-buying public. But this wasn't the only Joe Meek production which saw the light of the day in April 1966. This track is another example of a song that could only come out of Meek's studio. It wouldn't be strange to mistake it for a new wave recording from the late 70s or early 80s. The sound is so unusual that it doesn't even sound like a 60s recording. Certain parts of the song even seem to predate the sound of bands like Roxy Music by at least 6 years. The Riot Squad got their start in 1963, and went through several lineups over the years. An early lineup of the band featured future Jimi Hendrix drummer Mitch Mitchell. Later in 1967, David Bowie joined the band as their lead vocalist and stayed in the group for about a year. They managed to get some press attention due to their shocking live shows. But none of their singles achieved success in the charts. The Addicted Man by The Game caused quite a bit of controversy when it was originally released. The controversy prompted EMI to withdraw the single a few days after it was released. The Game were 5 teenagers from Mitcham, Surrey, who were very influenced by the mod sounds of bands like The Creation or The Who. Derek Johnson reviewed the single for Record Mirror.
The lyrics won't please everyone. Otherwise, it's a fairly pedantic sort of group sound with good instrumental splashes. Rather advanced musically.
But why was the single controversial? And what was it that prompted EMI to withdraw the single from release? The New Musical Express reported,
Last Saturday, 7 minutes were cut from BBC One's Jukebox Jury. The show, pre-recorded the previous weekend, included a lengthy discussion on the Game's recording of An Addicted Man, until on reflection, the corporation decided it was unsuitable for transmission.
Good evening and welcome once again to another session of Jukebox Jury.
The show featured an all-DJ panel consisting of Peter Murray, Alan Freeman, Simon D., and Jimmy Savile. Pete Murray commented that it was one of the most disgusting songs he'd ever heard. Disc Magazine reported,
EMI Records have withdrawn The Addicted Man by The Game, following protests by Jukebox Jury and the National Association on Drug Addiction. An EMI spokesman said that although they believed the record was an anti-drug addiction song, they had withdrawn it so as not to cause offense. But a few records already in the shops would not be called in.
The fact that only a few copies of the record were released explains why the single has become a highly sought-after collector's item. In recent years, copies of the single have exchanged hands on eBay or Discogs for more than £1,000. The B-side was another song very much in the style of the top side. Due to EMI withdrawing the record from release, the single obviously went nowhere. But this wasn't the only single by The Game which pioneered the punk sound of the late 70s. This This single, which was released just a month after The Addicted Man, is another excellent track with an unpolished sound that was way ahead of its time. Certain parts of the song even sound like the sort of material that the New York Dolls recorded on their first album.
I've always been misunderstood. It's not my fault, I swear.
Unfortunately, due to the controversy surrounding their previous single, this 45 got very little airplay, and the group broke up shortly after its release. October 1966 saw the release of one of the most aggressive and psychotic British singles of 1966. Him and the Others were formed in 1964, and this was the only single they ever issued. The record sold next to nothing when it was originally released, but this 45 has become a really valuable collector's item. An original copy of the single was recently sold for over £700. The group enjoyed decent popularity in clubs around London and the home counties, and they supported many of the major top acts from that period, as well as working as a backing group for chart singer Peter Fenton. In 1967, following the departure of bassist and founding member Lenny Shaw, the group changed its name to The Hands. The Wheels were formed in Belfast in the early 60s, and they're often associated with Van Morrison since they came from the same music scene. In fact, Van Morrison was even a member of the band for a short period of time. Bad Little Woman starts off as a cool bluesy number.
Little women, why eat a little women?
And it keeps building up in tempo until the song turns into a truly anarchic slice of punky rhythm and blues. The single went pretty much unnoticed when it was originally released in February 1966. A few months later, however, American band Shadows of Night recorded a cover of the song, which became a local hit in Chicago.
He always walks alone. Crawdaddy Simone.
All the songs featured on this video are either from 1966 or 1967. But this song by a band called the Syndicats, which was released in 1965, is just as wild or even wilder than the previous songs. The Syndicats were formed in London in 1964, and the group featured future Yes member Steve Howe on guitar. The guitarist played on the band's first two singles and left the group shortly before the recording of this track called Crawdaddy Simone, which featured Ray Fennick on guitar. The song, which was produced by Joe Meek, starts off as a fairly conventional bluesy tune.
Cheating was his trade. A seller of lies.
But it soon turns into total anarchic and chaotic madness. This is probably the noisiest recording of 1965, and it also features the most distorted and craziest guitar solo released that year, courtesy of guitarist Ray Fennick. In an interview several years later, the guitarist remembered.
But then Joe wanted a solo in the middle that was wild, and I had this de-Armand pedal, which was a volume tone which features on the Crying Game. It's that sound pre-wah-wahs. And he said, no, so I went wild, right? And he came back with a beer bottle, and he said, I want you to run this up and down the strings, like, and that became the Freak Beat solo.
Shortly after leaving this group, Steve Howe formed a band called The In Crowd, which would eventually morph into Tomorrow in late 1966. Not many people would associate Steve Howe with punk, but this B-side by The In Crowd, which was released in April 1965, is one of the most aggressive British singles from that period, and could definitely be regarded as an example of proto-punk from the 60s. song, with its manic intensity and raw unpolished sound, is yet another track that has achieved cult status through its appearance on several compilations over the years. As previously stated, the group changed its name to Tomorrow in late 1966, and achieved moderate success in the psychedelic underground scene in London. I hope you enjoyed this video highlighting a few proto-punk songs from the 60s. Of course, this was just a small selection, and there were many other songs recorded pretty much all over the world with a similar proto-punk sound. Feel free to mention them in the comments. See you next time.